All right, welcome to the session on public-private partnerships to advance global standardization. This session will be moderated by Chuck Romine, Charles Romine, if you wish, Associate Director for Laboratory Programs at NIST. And Chuck provides direction and operational guidance for all of NIST's scientific and technical laboratory programs, and serves as principal deputy to the Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology, that is to Lori, as NIST director. Prior to becoming ADLP in 2023, Chuck was the director of the Information Technology Laboratory, one of 6 NIST research laboratories with an annual budget of 160 million and nearly 400 employees. That, of course, pales compared to the job he has currently, which is almost $1 billion. And I don't know how many people work in the laboratories, probably around 3,000 people, if not more. As ITL director, Chuck oversaw research that cultivated trust in information technology and metrology. And of course, a lot of the great work that the laboratory did in cybersecurity, privacy, and a number of other areas over the last 10, 12 years. Chuck was the director of the lab with a lot of great people in that lab. Before joining NIST, Chuck spent 5 years at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he was responsible for providing technical and policy advice to the President's Science Advisor on all areas related to information technology. Chuck began his career, I won't say when, with the Department of Energy after receiving a PhD in applied math and a BA in mathematics, both from the University of Virginia. So if there's any Virginia people, Chuck is your man. He spent 15 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, conducting research on advanced algorithms for supercomputers, and 4 years at the Department of Energy Office of Science as program manager for the Office of Advanced Scientific Computing Research. So, Chuck, the floor is yours.
All right. Sean, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Forgive me for not going to the podium. The goal of this panel is to be highly conversational. And so I want to set the tone for that right away with some of my opening remarks. That was very kind of Sean to go over my whole history. It's sort of, it's always daunting to hear the sort of trajectory of one's own career. So I'll leave it at that. One of the things that Sean didn't mention is just how deeply I fell in love with this place when I joined it about 15 years ago. And I never thought after OSTP I would have the privilege of working at a job that I loved even more than that. That was exhilarating. And I got to NIST, frankly, a little depressed that OSTP might be the best job I'd ever have. And then I got here and like, no, this is way better. So for those of you who are at NIST, I share your joy in being here. And for those of you who are not at NIST, check the USA Jobs postings. It's a remarkable place. I want to talk a little bit about standards and its importance. You know, standards is in the name of our organization, and it's such a short word that describes such an extraordinarily powerful thing. You know, I started when I was the director of the Information Technology Lab. I created the Office of IT Standardization, and Lisa Carnahan was its first director. And I remember having a conversation with Lisa in which I said, look, I've been here at NIST for a long time, and I know a very small amount about standards. You know, you need to educate me so that I know everything about standards. And she said, I'm sorry, Chuck, but learning about standards is a lifelong activity. You're not going to know everything about standards. I'm still learning, and I've been in this field for a very, very long time. So that put everything into perspective for me. Another sort of perspective I got was when, even before I became ITL's director, we had a visitor from a major aerospace company who, during part of his remarks, said something that has always stuck with me. He said, you know, an airliner is just tens of thousands of standards flying in close formation. And I think that puts a lot of things in perspective. One of the things, another thing about standards is their ubiquity, not only their impact, but their ubiquity. They're everywhere. I think it's possible to go into a cabin in Montana somewhere and be completely off the grid, but I guarantee you will be within millimeters of standards. I don't care how careful you are. There's a standard that's going to affect your life, even in that sort of circumstance. So standards development is a noble activity. It's something that we cherish at NIST, and we cherish the partnerships that we have with the private sector as well. So one of the other thing about standards is the fact that participation is, at least in the United States, participation is available to all. We have participation, as Lori said, by government, NIST, and other government agencies, by the private sector, in a vast range of sectors and also sizes of organizations. And we also have an enormous amount of participation by civil society, by academia. You know, it goes on. And so one of the things that we're pledged to do with our private sector partners is to increase that participation and broaden it. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate the panel here today. We did have the opportunity to meet briefly before this panel, just to sort of talk about the things that were going to unfold here and what we were going to be discussing. And even that pre-session was lively, and we were laughing and having fun doing it. And I think that's a pretty good sign that this is going to be a great conversation to have. So I'm really looking forward to this. Public-private partnerships, which I always say slowly because otherwise I'll trip on the alliteration, plays an absolutely essential role in the development of standards, but also in pre-standardization activities. And we're going to talk a lot about that as well in this panel. So I'm going to stop talking now because you didn't come here to hear me, you came to hear a spirited discussion, and I'd like to dive into that. So with that, I'm very, very pleased and excited to welcome our esteemed panelists today. I have to tell you, the fact that we can attract this caliber of people to NIST is a testament to how much NIST is esteemed by the private sector and by the standards community. Each of our panelists here today, some of them are old friends, some of them new friends to me, brings a wealth of experience in standards development. And I'm really eager, as I'm sure we all are, to hear their perspectives on how we can continue to foster successful partnerships between government, academia, the private sector, and beyond. And so particularly in the area of critical and emerging technologies is a fast-moving set of sectors where getting the standardization right, I think, is really going to have to be a priority. It is a priority for NIST, and I think should be a priority for the nation. So with that, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to provide a roughly 2-minute introduction to themselves. We talked about this. It's often the case that panels like this, each person will talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then by the time you're ready to dive in, an hour has elapsed or more. And we all collectively decided that wasn't really what we wanted to do. We wanted to have the conversation take center stage. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Mary, one of the old friends that I referred to. No, sorry, one of the past friends.
Past friends?
No, that's wrong too.
No.
You can't fix it. Just stop.
I can't fix it. I'll stop.
So thank you, Chuck. Happy to be here.
Took myself a whole
Yeah, no, it's fine. So we've known each other for quite some time. So, and I'm probably a little bit of a ringer here on the panel, but a more positive way of putting it is I've been on both the public sector side of the public-private partnership and now on the private sector side of the very important partnership. So spent most of my federal government career with the U.S. Department of Commerce, both with the International Trade Administration and more than 23 years at NIST. So as a political science and economist, I'm not a technologist, but I had the benefit of learning from a wide range of very outstanding technical experts across the NIST laboratories and the extramural programs. And I've been doing standards policy that entire time at NIST. It's been really a pleasure for me to have NIST colleagues and across the federal government, and now 7.5 years at ANSI as the Senior VP for Government Relations and Public Policy. So as I said, I just stepped with my same portfolio over from the Commerce Department side to the ANSI side, and I think I see the value of the partnership, the various types of partnerships from both directions. I'm very happy to be here to contribute to this esteemed panel. Lots of friends that I've known for quite some time and some new friends as well. And I think we're looking forward to a robust discussion of the various modalities in which we all collaborate to achieve really high impact standards. Thanks.
Yes, thanks.
Andy.
So perhaps I'm one of the new friends, but ASTM International certainly isn't, right? So I'm Andy Kireta. I'm the president of ASTM International for all of about 4.5 months. I started on May 1st, but I'm no stranger to the U.S. voluntary consensus standard development ecosystem, I would say, and maybe bring an interesting perspective today. I started out as a mechanical engineer designing piping systems in nuclear power plants. So I was a standards user. Never in that time in my career did I actually think, how are they written? Where does this information come from? How does everyone get together? I moved to the copper industry where I spent 32 years actually engaged in standards development from the industry side. So building the standards, bringing experts together in ASTM, ASME, UL, you name it, standards developers across the US and throughout the world to really actually put that expertise into motion. And I would say over that period of time, what that brought to me is really not only an understanding, but a value and a respect for the power of voluntary consensus standards, how nimble, how effective they can be at creating innovation, moving industries forward, protecting public safety and product quality, right? Just how, and I was just impressed at how you can engage so many experts that outside of the room are competing with each other. You know, they don't want each other to succeed. They want to beat them. You put them in that room and how they advance an entire industry and an entire society and an economy. So it was that real power of that voluntary consensus process that made me continue on through ASTM as a 9-year board member, as their invisible chairman of the board in 2020, when every meeting was virtual. And then when the position arose or the opportunity arose to be able to come in and join with such great colleagues and such a great organization, I jumped at it. And we're going to talk about public-private partnerships, right? I have to do the same thing. And really that comes to the value of participation, engagement, and empowerment across every voice that cares, right? One of the sayings that we use all the time is that every voice matters. And I truly believe that. All of our organizations really take great pride in creating open, inclusive, transparent processes, but just getting every voice to the table doesn't mean every voice can be effective, right? So that's what we've got to look at and that's what we're looking at is how do we become more effective at creating those standards developers of the future so that they can get in, they can enable this system to continue to be nimble, agile, and powerful, and give first mover advantage to those organizations that are involved. So that is really one of the things that we're committed to do. The other thing I would say is we tend to gather around in these groups when a bunch of new things come about, right? We're here because of critical and emerging technologies. And I would say, as I look back, I get an outside look at ASTM, is we were really formed around critical and emerging technologies 126 years ago. right? Railroad was disrupting the transportation industry. The challenge of the chemical composition, mechanical properties of steel rail was all brand new, right? It was the thing that it was actually the critical and emerging technology of the day. So the times change, the technology changes, but the power of the consensus process doesn't. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Wow, it's really hard to follow, Andy. That was fabulous. I was nodding along the whole time. So my name is Dan Burnett, and I'm also, like Andy, recent in my current role at ISTO. So I'll talk about my background a little bit and then talk about ISTO, which is interesting in itself. So I have a PhD in computer science using neural networks for speech recognition. So I was doing neural networks before they were cool. Interestingly, I'd been doing that for a company named Nuance in Silicon Valley. I had moved there just to work for them. And there was this standard that W3C was working on, and I had learned about it, and I thought, this thing is terrible. I don't know why anybody's using that. My boss said, well, why don't you go to that meeting and tell them, that they need to do it differently. And I remember going to the meeting and realizing that my company needed to be involved ASAP. And that began my standards career. So I've spent more than 25 years now, more than a dozen standards. I love it, but it's all been web and internet standards. So I've been involved in some of the most cutting edge computer science technologies of the last 25 years, bleeding edge in some cases. I actually worked for large companies, small companies, mostly startups. I spent 3 years as the executive director of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. That is Ethereum, the blockchain technology, okay? Trying to get standards advanced there. I am right now the president and CEO of ISTO. So in 1999, IEEE, most of you have probably heard of IEEE, formed the Industry Standards and Technology Organization as a separate organization to host and help support alliances. And that was specifically to help accelerate adoption of the technology, because one of the challenges with standards, as we all know, is a standard is useless if you're the only one using it. Okay, so we've had a number of different alliances as members of our federation. One of them, for example, the Wireless Power Consortium that defines the CHIS mobile charging standard that we probably all use every night when we set our phones on the charger, just to give you an example. But there have been a number of different organizations like that we host. I think one thing that is a little different about us compared to some of our others in the ecosystem who host alliances is that we are a not-for-profit. We are a 501c6. And so every one of our alliances is actually a member of our organization. And I'll go ahead and stop there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Actually, I have one. You can keep this.
Oh, you have one?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Miller, and I'm the president and CEO of ATIS. And I want to say I'm both honored and delighted to be here today. And thank you for including me. I've been in this industry a very long time, the ICT industry, and I'll tell you a little bit about my organization. But in terms of my background, I like to say I'm a lawyer by training and an engineer by osmosis. And most of my career has been spent learning engineering on a napkin, drawing. But I've been had the pleasure of being surrounded in my organization by 2,000 subject matter experts. I started my career, who remembers this, the time of AT&T divestiture? Yeah, I was part of that. And at the time I was working on Wall Street, and I had the honor and the privilege of birthing the organization that I now run. I spent some time being its general counsel and then moved up the ranks to become the president and CEO in 1999. I've seen every major pivot in advanced communications. And I really liked your comment about tens of thousands of standards to build an airplane, because I think that's really true about delivering a wireless call. Tens of thousands of standards. So a little bit about ATIS. It's a US-based organization, and we have a very diverse portfolio supporting the ICT industry, everything from pre-standardization analysis. And I think that word is interesting because we haven't talked about that a whole lot, right? It's become sort of the new and norm, like, wow, there's a magic that happens before standardization. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But we also do best practices, white papers, technical reports, proof of concepts, specifications, open source, and business analyses. We have 165 companies that make up what we do, and we collaborate, as you might expect, we innovate, and we address a lot of the needed wide-ranging technology solutions. And we're kind of on the cusp of what's happening in advanced communications. Clearly, we work in 5G. We've launched standardization in 6G, and we're actually looking beyond. We work in quantum, cybersecurity, smart cities, robocalling, unmanned aerial vehicles, distributed ledger technologies, user-controlled privacy, using self-sovereign identity, and artificial intelligence, the network applications of AI. So we really have this very, very broad scope. We also serve as the nexus for North American collaboration supporting next generation technology leadership. And I think most notable is our role, ATIS's role in serving as the North American operating partner for 3GPP. I'm sure many of you have heard about the third generation partnership project. It actually produces specifications for 5G and 5G advanced, and most recently launched 6G standardization. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. That's on a 21-month timeline study item that will actually begin in 2025. But the industry, the global industry, has already unveiled how it's thinking about the use cases for 6G. And then more recently, as a call to action for North American leadership on 6G, we launched the NextG Alliance, and it brings together the private sector, the government, and academia to advance North American wireless technology in 6G. I'm very proud to say that NIST is a member of the NextG Alliance, as is NTIA, the FCC, the FirstNet Authority, and the Department of Defense. Interestingly, we have 17 government members across our organization. So I feel like everything we touch is a public-private partnership in one form or another. And we really value that relationship with the government. The thing about the NextG Alliance that I think is really interesting, because I think this is the way that standards are being looked at. They are now being looked at in the context of the full life cycle of putting a product or a service to market. So when we put the NextG Alliance together, it started with R&D. It started with looking at manufacturing. It's just launching standardization, and it will go all the way and reach into market readiness and commercialization. So I think looking at standardization in that context is really, really important to any industry that you're working in. So again, I'm delighted to be here today and look forward to our conversation.
And George.
So good morning, everybody. George Borlase from UL Standards and Engagement, and really just thrilled and honored to be up here with everybody today. And I may be one of those older friends that Chuck Romine mentioned earlier. And I will say that I worked with both Dr. Romine and Dr. Beers at OSTP. And frankly, it was working with them that inspired me to come back into civil service for 10 years, where I ended up spending 8 years as a senior executive at the Consumer Product Safety Commission also. So for those of you at NIST or outside of NIST, lucky enough to work with Dr. Romine and Dr. Beers, I hope you find it as inspiring and frankly, developmentally just wonderful as I did. So wanted to start with that word of appreciation to both of you. I have been in the safety world for well over 20 years in a number of different capacities, starting actually active duty in the Coast Guard and reflecting on being in uniform on a beautiful day today, 23 years ago, and how that really changed everything for the service when I was in it too. But my first standard, Andy, was the ASTM standard test method for inclining vessels, because I was all about initial stability and dynamic stability on small vessels back then. So my first real professional exposure with the standard was the ASTM standard. And in the safety world, having done it for the last 20 years, whether it was ship safety and doing forensics investigations, say of fishing vessel accidents, ship and aircraft safety with NOAA, or consumer product safety at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. One of the things I think you're hearing a lot today too is the why. Why do we do this? And why do we come to work every day and commit ourselves to safety and standards and standardization? And I'll say my why is because of the life jacket standard that we have. And somewhere out there is a 40-year-old man now who has an amazing story of when he was 13 and the Coast Guard pulled him hypothermic out of Port St. Joe Bay down in Florida, because the canoe he borrowed from his grandfather capsized. And he was floating in the water for 45 minutes and wouldn't have lived if it wasn't for the life jacket standard. And that's my why. And I think everybody up here has a why just like that, that they can bring every day. And just want to call on that to reflect on the why too. So why at UL Standards and Engagement then? We're a global nonprofit, if we heard that before too, with a mission of making the world a safer, more secure, and more sustainable place. And we do that a number of ways. The first piece of it is as a standards development organization. And in fact, we're the only SDO that is both accredited in Canada and the United States, and then also authorized to do fire and other standards in Mexico. So we've got a strong trilateral approach on standards here in North America. But the other piece, which I think really applies for today, is our advocacy and the power of convening. And a lot of it, frankly, is because of our status as a nonprofit, to be able to bring folks together in a way that you may not be able to do solely as industry and solely as the government, along with talking adoption of our standards, data collection, and public service campaigns. And I think Andy stole my line, because UL Standards really started in Underwriters Laboratories started in 1893 with the Chicago World's Fair and the Columbia Exposition, because there was this new thing called electrification. And this may sound familiar. They were replacing oil and gas with electricity. They were putting electricity places where it hadn't been before. There was an ongoing debate of AC versus DC. How are we going to transmit all of this electricity? Which way is going to be most effective? They were really concerned about the risk of fire. Underwriters, Laboratories. It was the underwriters, the insurance underwriters, that were most worried about losing all of their money when the whole Chicago World's Fair burned down. And don't forget, Chicago did have a history of major fires taking out half the city, right? So understandable their concern. And they wanted to know, how do you safely innovate? Because they were going to have the World's Fair. It was going to be the best one ever. They were going to have the Columbia Exposition with electricity, which was going to change the world. And how do they do that? And they brought in a young, talented engineer, not this one, a different one, to come in and work on that. And in fact, our first UL standard was UL 10, published in 1910 on tin-clad fire doors. And so I've been doing the standards work for the last 120 years. I think though, as we look at the standards that we're creating now, probably on things a little more complicated than a tin-clad fire door, and I think that's part of today's discussion. And I will say, reflecting also on the comments, I won't go with public-private partnership because I'm more alliteration, but I'll call it P cubed. And you may say, well, why P cubed instead of 3P? And I think because it's so multidimensional. So I'll kind of roll out that engineering mathematical tidbit. But I do view it as very multidimensional. I'm looking forward to this conversation as we cover all those dimensions.
Thank you, George, so much. And thanks to all the panelists. Exactly right. I have to say, I've just realized why I think this panel is going to be so exciting. It's because every single person is a storyteller. there's a story behind both how they got to where they are and also the work that their organization does. And so there's nothing more powerful than that. Speaking of a story that I want to tell, I want to be sure that I acknowledge the program coordination, standards coordination office. My apologies for the organization of this event. This is a really heavy lift, and I'm really grateful to those folks for supporting me, but supporting NIST and the entire event. And I also want to take the time to acknowledge just how fiercely proud we are of the folks at NIST who engage in standards development, either as a participant or in a leadership role. It really does make a difference. You get to change the world in meaningful ways. And I think you can't say anything more important, more powerful than that. And so to all of you who are involved, the hundreds of people and many hundreds of organizations that you represent, or engagements that you represent, thank you for that. So with that, I have one question to start everybody off, and this is the only question that I'm going to ask all of the panelists to react to. After that, it's going to be more of a sort of voluntary, and if no one raises a hand, which I don't think will happen, these are very engaging folks, then I'll start picking folks, but I don't think I'll need to do that. There's a lot of perhaps misunderstanding about what it is that we're talking about when we say public-private partnerships. They come in a range of sizes and in a range of engagement models. And I thought the best way to really ferret that out would be to have each of our panelists talk a little bit about a model that has supported their goals. What public-private partnership model would you point to support your goals? Give an example. And then explain how that model works and how it was employed for the goals that you're trying to achieve, and then the resulting impacts. And I can reiterate that question to anybody who needs it later, but let's go ahead and down the line as we did before. Mary, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. And I neglected to say it when I introduced myself that ANSI is not like the other folks. We are not a standards developer. We are the coordinator of the private sector standard system, and all of my colleagues here are members as well as federal agencies. And we've spent, I know ANSI has spent, both when I was with the government and private sector, a lot of time looking at models for collaboration and cooperation. And as Chuck said, there are many, and they are varied depending on the situation and the need. We did just publish a report this week on public-private standards-driven public-private partnerships, giving examples of different models and about 20 use cases. And I commend you to that for something of a baseline discussion. It's a little hard to pick a particular type of partnership, particularly coming from ANSI, because there are many. We are the national standards body representing the US and ISTO and IEC, and that in a sense is a participation model. And there are many other convening mechanisms that we use to bring our members and other stakeholders together. But I'll just choose our standards facilitation program or the standards collaboratives that we've been putting together for about 20 years. I think I was the government chair of one of the first collaboratives, which was the Homeland Security Standards Panel at the time. But that model of standards facilitation and coordination embraces bringing all of the relevant stakeholders together, the interested and materially affected stakeholders who want to participate in identifying first what standards exist in a particular technology or area of interest, what gaps exist, and then coalescing the various relevant standards developing organizations and venues around addressing those priority gaps that have been determined by the range of stakeholders built based on market needs. So as I said, ANSI's been doing that for about 20 years, and there are 5 or 6 examples of the full heavy lift of collaboratives, which lead to standards roadmaps and then are maintained. I'll just give you one example, which is the unmanned or uncrewed, as we should call them now, uncrewed aerial systems collaborative, which was asked for by the Federal Aviation Administration to identify safe integration of uncrewed aerial systems into the national airspace, but engaged and continues to engage about 400 individuals from 250 organizations, a range of federal agencies, because not only if FAA has an interest in the uncrewed UAS or UAV, but law enforcement agencies have a significant interest, and a range of others. So Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, FBI, and a lot of other agencies, as well as large and small companies, civil society, the hobbyists who are very interested in the new regulations, not restricting the hobbyist use of drones. And so that collaborative was first established in 2017, has published since its inception 3 roadmaps and 3 gaps progress reports. They're getting to the point now where there's likely to be another full-blown roadmap as the technology continues to evolve. But I provide that as an example. These are heavy lifts. They require a lot of participation from stakeholders, in-depth participation. The collaboratives don't develop standards, but they're establishing priority gaps that should be addressed by various standards organizations, which would include, where relevant, ICAO, ISO and IEC, ASTM, ATIS, and a range of other standard, and UL, a range of other standards developing organizations. And we think, given the fact that the US has a very rich standards ecosystem, which we see as a significant advantage, these types of collaboratives do surface a lot of interest that might not be surfaced in a more top-down standards system, and also engage a wider range of stakeholders in a technology area or a particular national priority area. So I offer that as an example of one of the collaboration mechanisms that I think we have found very useful and continue to be available to areas of interest as these move forward. There are lots of other smaller lift, but maybe a series of workshops or a series of public information sharing sessions. But in the end, it's all about identifying all the relevant stakeholders and getting their needs and their priorities out on the table, and information sharing and continued information sharing, which I think is critical in these fast-moving technology sectors. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to start with the collaborative mechanism. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Andy.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm gonna go into 2. One very briefly, because it's sort of the basis for all of this and what many of the standards development organizations have relied on for many, many years, and that's a direct participation model. So at ASTM, we have 148 technical committees operating across 90 different industry sectors. So there's quite a bit of breadth. And one of our goals is to really bring the value of our process across as many technologies or industry sectors as possible to really advance standardization, safety, quality, security. And the direct participation of the public sector in ASTM standards is very obvious when we have 2,000 out of our 30,000 ASTM members participating in the process coming from government. And interestingly, 10% of those come directly from NIST. We have at least 200 direct participants from NIST staff across probably, if we looked it up, 93 to 95% of our 148 technical committees. So thank you, NIST, for a great participation. But then if you look at that, it goes across the US government. So Department of Defense, Consumer Product Safety Commission, you name it. Where we get that participation, it helps lead us forward in knowing where are we going, what advanced standardization do we have to do, where does regulation look like it's going to proceed. And so just bringing that information in and also having them in the room to collaborate with industry and users. So that one is, I think, probably common to all of us. But then as we look at these new technologies, they tend not to be industry focused, right? So these are transversal or horizontal technologies. How do you take one model and actually make that work? And what we found is you probably can't do that. You know, we need a direct participation model. We need to combine it with a consortium model or with a direct funding model. And one of the examples we've had great success with is our Additive Manufacturing Center of Excellence, right? And so interestingly enough, it was born from NIST activity. 2 roadmaps out of NIST in 2013 and 2016, looking at the additive manufacturing space, identifying technology and standards gaps. We took heed of that, and in 2018, we stood up this Center of Excellence that was really looking at bringing a couple of those different models together. So direct participation, our Center of Excellence started with NASA being included, NIST is included, Department of Defense is included, because additive manufacturing really could cut across a very significant portion of those 90 industries that we cover. And trying to do it in a very vertical fashion just is not going to be effective. But what we realized is that there were about 30 identified standard gaps that needed to be addressed. And the only way to start addressing them was in pre-standardization activity. So our Center of Excellence really looked at bringing together a direct funding mechanism, brought in tens of millions of dollars of investment into research to start addressing those gaps. Well, generally that happens in addressing the technology. Standardization comes afterwards, right? So let's figure out where the technology is going. And a lot of times I look at emerging technologies as their solutions in search of problems, right? In many cases. So it's how do we connect the solution and the problem across those verticals? And we need to get the bleeding edge research together and really create a research to standardization roadmap where if we're going to do research, they're thinking about what can we standardize coming out of the end of this. That isn't the entire intent, but is there a deliverable that would advance the floor, that will raise the floor across the technology so that industries can use it effectively? And then all of those others participating in research get that additional value-added information that they can use to advance their interests. So it really brings together a lot of these models. And now we went from NIST and NASA participation, Department of Defense, FDA, cutting across all the industries that it touches. And I would say from a success standpoint, we've had 34 projects addressing those 30 standards gaps. 13 new standards have already been published in the additive manufacturing space under our F42 committee. We have 14 in process that will be published. Well, we know how standards development work. You can't ever predict that. So, and it's really right now, all of that standardization work resulting from those projects is happening across 30 plus of our technical committees and industries. So really a pretty good example of success of bringing those models together.
Fantastic. Great. Dan.
Thank you. I really liked what you said about a solution in search of a problem, because that's probably the domain in which I've operated for 25 years. I've basically been working with technologists. These are people who they come up with something that is new, some new capability, and then they just drive forward. And so the fascinating thing about that is that at some point they realize they need standards. Sometimes they realize it pretty quickly, but the standards are always being developed in conjunction with the technology. And sometimes the standards work itself drives the technology live. Now understand the timescales that I'm talking about here. There was a phrase, web speed, that got used a lot when the web was being developed. By the way, for those of you who don't know the difference between internet and web, right? Internet is sort of the core communications, and the web is the presentation layer that we have on top in terms of web pages and whatnot. So I'm going to give some examples. Public-private partnership approaches. Well, actually, I'm going to change it altogether. In fact, thank you for reminding me. So it's interesting, the spaces that I've operated in would probably call this public and government participation. I want you to think about that change for a moment. Because from the perspective of most of these newer groups, the public is not the government, what's referred to as public up here. The public is anyone in the world. And so it's a change in perspective that I think is really important in understanding how those new technologies are being developed. They're very clearly being developed for the world. I'm very pleased that many of the standards organizations where the standards are being developed are in the United States and are respected for what they do globally. I think that's a real testament to the U.S. and the value that we bring here. So I want to give some examples. First, from ISTO. So in May 2020, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering released the Modular Open Systems Approach Reference Frameworks in Defense Acquisition Programs, where it says successful MOSA implementations have proved the proper application of modular approaches and flexible open system architectures allow for system components to evolve to respond to changing needs. Accordingly, the department is moving from unique architectures and closed systems that are inflexible and cost prohibitive to architectures that include the use of open interface standards with modular systems to facilitate continuous adaptation and upgrades. One thing I find fascinating about that is almost the description of why standards are valuable for everyone. So as a result of that, the Space Systems MOSA Interface Standards Alliance was established at ISTO specifically for the purpose of voluntary consensus and standards development. And they're basically updating US space system interface standards, MIL specs, and MOSA laws as specified for major defense acquisition programs. So NASA and Boeing are participants. And the goal was to develop standards to facilitate and enforce the implementation of standardized interfaces for enterprise space systems and promote interoperability. What's interesting about this to me is that this is very much direct involvement. This is essentially a portion of the government saying, we want this alliance. Most of the work actually requires security clearance that I don't have, for example. So we provide support services, but they're able to do the work that they need in a confidential manner, but using rules and processes that work for them. One of the other ones that I want to give as an example from ISTO is the Unify Consortium. And so you can see I'm almost reading from notes here. It's been a few months at this new organization, so I want to get all the words right.
Don't worry about it. I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah. So the Universal Interoperability for Grid Forming Inverters Consortium. It's a U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office-funded effort to advance grid forming inverter technology. They're facilitating the transition of electric power grids around the world to seamlessly accommodate grid forming technology through needed R&D, generating best practices and standards, and so on. The impact is power grids of the future will yield more affordable, secure, reliable, clean, and sustainable grids. So again, here's another example of something that is really driven by a need in the public sector level. One of the other things that I want to talk about as an example has to do with some of my experience in W3C. When I gave my introduction, I didn't mention a couple of the standards that I worked on. One was WebRTC, which underlies Teams, Google Meet, et cetera. If you do any video communication in a web browser, it uses WebRTC. So I was one of the original editors of that spec, and wrote one of the early books on it and stuff like that. One of the things that was challenging with that standard was that I should first point out the real advantage of that standard. Zoom actually took a lot of what we did as an inspiration, and all of that work happened to have been done before the pandemic. So we didn't know the pandemic was coming, but I'm personally very pleased that a lot of the world was able to keep functioning in large part because of the work that we did. So again, stories that really matter. But one of the things that was frustrating in that group is that the time pressure for the web community is so severe that the standard essentially never finished. It continues to evolve. I think this is a challenge. It's particularly a challenge for interoperability. You have to have at least some staging points that people can look at and say, we conform to this specific version. So there's been a tremendous pressure in IETF and definitely in W3C to have the time cycles be shortened, allow for these more evergreen standards, which is very different from traditional standards development that has a process that completes with a specific version, and then maybe you start the next version. And even W3C operated that way for many years. So one thing that I found interesting is in a newer set of standards that are being developed at W3C that I've also been heavily involved in, that's verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers. These are in the decentralized identity or distributed identity, however you want to call it, space. And yeah, I was one of the original spec writers for verifiable credentials and chaired both working groups at W3C, because when I first learned about the interest in this effort, I knew I wanted this for my children. And that is why I started doing it. I had no company supporting me for that effort. Well, one of the interesting things that's happened there is the US Department of Homeland Security Silicon Valley Innovation Program was really frustrated by having single source, vendors, essentially. They were just tired of it. And they said, particularly in the identity space, they wanted more competition, more cooperation, more interoperability. So what they did is they actually they provided funding to a small cohort of companies that wanted to work with them. And one of the requirements was that all of those companies would participate in the standardization process at W3C. So they insisted on these companies participating in the effort, but they did not participate directly themselves. They follow it, but they don't actually drive it. And I've heard a lot of positive comments from SVIP about this in terms of them having a cohort that can actually work together. So they know that they have a collection now of companies that can all be suppliers to both Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection actually are both involved in this. So I wanted to give both of those as a contrast, because I think WebRTC, that was something that WebRTC still has a challenge with today. But the involvement of the Silicon Valley Innovation Program and the VCN did work is something that is trying to help put some constraints, but they're the right kinds of constraints. They're not saying how the work needs to be done, but they're putting pressure on eventually having conformance and interoperability, which is, I think, at the level of development of the technology, that's the right way to engage. You don't want to get too heavy-handed yet on exactly what the solutions have to be, because that can stifle the innovation, which is so critically important on these emerging technologies.
I think the Homeland Security compelling the participants to participate in standards, that sort of involuntary consensus standards, right? Anyway, thanks very much. Susan.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm going to talk about ATIS's MVP, its Minimum Viable Profile Initiative. And I think it's a great example of a blended PPP model. I highly commend reading ANSI's paper. Last night I was saying, okay, what example am I going to use and which bucket does it fit in? And what you find is when it comes to public-private partnerships, it's they tend to be more blended across the various names that have been attached to them. But this one involved direct participation, standards acceleration, and I really want to call it standards and market acceleration, because I think it's really important to recognize the value of standardization to the marketplace. And I'll talk a little bit about how that played out in this particular public-private partnership. And it was also, this particular initiative was also policy driven. So next week, you're getting this in real time. We're actually going to be releasing the MVP. And what it does is it defines a minimum set of technical requirements that are common across all North American operators, the Verizons, the T-Mobiles, the AT&Ts, the US Cellulars of the world, to foster the development and integration of open radio access network technologies within their networks, ORAN. You've probably heard that acronym quite often. And what this MVP does is it sets a baseline for a minimum set of requirements and features that will ultimately create a more robust and competitive vendor ecosystem. This really grew out of NTIA's objective to create a more innovative and diverse supply chain and accelerate the development and deployment of Open RAN technology, which was really the motivation for the CHIPS and Science Act. I'm sure many of you have heard about that, $1.5 billion of investment in the industry. And this MVP turns out to be a very important foundational piece of the next NOFO that is coming out relative to the distribution of these funds. So what happened is NTIA approached the industry to create an MVP in a very short period of time. And the industry turned to ATIS, and I think this is true of many standards development organizations because of its diversity of membership, its neutrality, and that it could really deliver a consensus output on a technically complex matter. And I think that happens across all of your organizations, right? It's why you're sought out. You have the industry at the table. This is a very contentious space because if the MVP is successful, it will really expand the vendor marketplace beyond the incumbent infrastructure vendors. So you can appreciate to get the new innovative companies to the table, competing with the existing infrastructure vendors. There's going to be quite a dynamic in developing this MVP. And that's actually what we've seen play out. It's been 6 months of weekly meetings, and we will deliver that MVP and unveil it next week. So what really made it work? First of all, there was no magic about it. There was a lot of hard work. But first and foremost, the government trusted the industry, the private sector, to take the lead in developing the solution. It's a very complex solution. And then the government stayed at the table to answer the questions and offer guidance where and when it was needed. That was a powerful part of the partnership, government recognizing where the expertise was resident. Secondly, it was a very focused stakeholder community. We probably did the thing that is taboo. We didn't have it completely open. We had 25 invited companies because we knew what our mission was, what our objective was, and to do this very, very quickly. The third thing that made it work was it was central to a policy objective. It had to happen, and it had to happen in a very short time. And I think the final thing that's just noteworthy about this is it's a fact about the model that we used. There was no government funding. And I think any of us who sit in these organizations and are delivering work at the urging of the government would love to see more funding to support the kinds of work that needs to happen. But I think that's a mantra that we've all conveyed many times over, but it's a very important one. This reflected a tremendous commitment by the industry with an expectation of the government that the industry would actually deliver it. And that's often the energy that happens between the private sector and the government. We need you to do this, and we need it within a certain period of time, and we need it because it's an important policy objective. So we've learned a lot. It's been very demanding to achieve this within 6 months and get a consensus across a very diverse industry. And we'll start to see what the impact of it is as NTIA starts to administer more funds relative to Open RAN technology. Thanks.
And George.
So I'm going to just mention one example, the ULS&E TRIP program. And I feel comfortable using acronyms with this audience because I think we're all very much lovers of FLAs, which are 4-letter acronyms, maybe 5, and TLAs, 3-letter acronyms, which also can be 2. But for UL Standards and Engagement, our thermal runaway incident program, which is really focused on overheating batteries in aircraft. Last month, a nonstop flight from San Francisco transatlantic turned around about an hour in because somebody in business class got their laptop caught in the seat. And you mentioned 10,000 standards in an airplane. That's to address 10,000 risks. And especially when you're at 40,000 feet over the ocean, there's a lot of risks that you want to properly manage. And one of the ones that is an increasing risk the aircraft aviation industry seeing is thermal runaway. And so they actually had a number of industry members approach UL Standards and Engagement about setting up a voluntary reporting program. So the FAA has a mandatory reporting program with requirements. Not surprisingly, the industry was loath to just report everything to the regulator, but they also knew that they had a growing risk. And how could they come together and be able to talk in a candid way about what they're seeing without giving away, say, business confidential information, et cetera? Came to UL Standards and Engagement. And Susan, you said the word trust, and it was exactly because of that. So we now have 35 passenger and cargo airlines, some of the largest in the world, that are all voluntarily reporting every time they have a battery thermal runaway incident in an aircraft, whether passenger or cargo. And this could involve overheating of batteries, et cetera. And it's a program that's grown almost twice in size in the last year or two as other companies see the value of this voluntary reporting. A couple of the successes from it, just a couple years ago, using the direct participation method, UL Standards and Engagement developed a voluntary consensus standard for containment bags that some of the airlines now carry, where if they have a battery that goes in a thermal runaway, you can put it in this containment bag, add some water, and it suppresses the fire until you can address it more fully. Another thing that we've been able to do on the advocacy side for the first time is publicly release the data along with focus groups that we conducted, because part of the issue for the airlines is all about passenger behavior. They say you cannot pack any lithium-ion batteries in checked baggage, because if it goes in the thermal runaway in the cargo compartment, you're not going to know until you really have an extreme situation. 27% of passengers that we polled said, oh yeah, I packed batteries in my checked baggage. And I will not ask for a show of hands here to embarrass anybody. What else we found was that the airlines say, oh yes, every announcement, we make sure it's clear about batteries and the risk. And 25% of passengers that we polled said, I never hear that announcement, as much as they probably don't hear all of the rest of it. So the other aspect of it we're looking at on the advocacy side is the passenger behavior. And what do we need to do to increase education and awareness from the passenger behavior side in a way, because we recognize that from our information, there are at least 4 devices with lithium-ion batteries brought on per passenger, sometimes more. And if there's an incident, and a severe incident resulting from thermal runaway, one of the options is not going to be, well, we just won't allow lithium-ion batteries on aircraft anymore. One, they're integrated in the aircraft in a lot of cases. And 2, that means no cell phones, no laptops, no batteries, recognizing that's not the way forward. And so participating in the FAA has a FACA, the LEVISAC, if you love acronyms, the Lithium Battery Incident Safety Advisory Committee that they've put together that we're participating in. And I think a really successful example of a PQ, public-private partnership, P3, if however we want to describe it, focused on an emerging risk where we're really trying to manage it so that we're not doing the forensics afterwards, just to ask what happened.
Okay, wow, that was a tremendous array of different types of public-private partnerships, and I appreciate everyone for the underlying reasons why those work. And for those of you who know me at NIST, I think you're probably all wondering, when is Chuck going to talk about trust? Because I never appear in public without talking about trust. And so for both Susan and George and the rest of you as well, thank you for teeing that up. One of the things that is exciting about working at a place like NIST is this neutrality that we have as a government representative in the standards organizations. We have no hidden agenda. We have no bias, and yet we have deep technical expertise that we can bring to bear in some of these areas. So one of the reasons it's so stimulating and fantastic for us to work in the standards arena is the combination of those two things that makes it magic. I want to go on to some of the more optional questions now. So I'm going to have to ask for a show of hands. I'm going to try to, there's been a, let's see, left to right bias so far. So in an effort to be neutral, I'm going to try to go a little more right to left. So one of the questions I want to sort of tee up for you is, in what way can public-private partnerships be utilized effectively to advance standardization specifically for economic development in the United States? And then what are the priorities that you see for public-private partnerships to advance standards in general? So can I see anybody who's interested in tackling that one? Dan, do you want to? If I don't see a hand, I'm going to call somebody out. So.
Interesting. I think that was one of the ones I said I wasn't.
No, you said you were.
Yeah, well, give it to me again.
So how would public-private partnerships be most effectively used to advance the economy of the United States?
Yeah, so now I remember what I wanted to say about this one. So I'm gonna use a dirty word here, and that's blockchain. And the reason I know it's a dirty word now is because I spent a number of years trying to understand the depth of that current perception and what would be required to change it because of the real positive uses that can come from it. And one of the things that was, I actually lost my train of thought. That's terrible.
That's all right. Andy?
Go ahead, and
I
then I'll
told
jump
you I
in.
wasn't going to answer this question.
That's all
either,
right.
But I'll
Go for it.
jump in. So, talking about advancing the U.S. economy and in the end, even though we are all driving towards standardization, right? Standardization can help improve competitiveness. We're fortunate to live in a country that has led in innovative development. Many of the world's most innovative companies are located here. Most innovative research institutes are located here. But we can't bring that power of thought to competition, market access, market acceptance, unless we can have an effective system where every company in a space isn't competing on every single aspect of every technology or product. Because otherwise what we end up with is we end up with fads rather than trends. And the only difference between a fad and a trend is the early adoption curve looks exactly the same. In a fad, it falls off and never plateaus into real market acceptance. So being able to standardize things that we don't have to compete on quickly gives U.S. businesses and the U.S. economy a chance to really take advantage of that thing I mentioned earlier, which is first mover advantage. Being able to get folks in the room, agreeing that we can standardize mobile phone charging or whatever it might be, that we can actually create enough mass and enough value to drive market acceptance. Really helps advance the U.S. economy. If we can't do that, and we can't do it in a bubble, right? Otherwise, we end up getting what we all have, right? You open up your backpack, you're traveling to Europe or Asia, you've got 8 different adapters on what you're going to eat, right? That's a kind of a failure of standardization. We can't do it in a bubble. Be in the companies, the organizations that can develop those from the ground up as that technology emerges gives the U.S. an advantage.
Very good.
Dan,
do you want to finish?
I'd like to just finish. Sorry. Thanks. So what I was going to talk about actually was the fact that lack of support at sort of the political level or highest levels in government of blockchain technology. I have heard directly from many people, many innovators, that they're leaving the U.S. Okay. Now I bring that up because one of the things that standards development does is to where the standards get developed ends up being a hub for that particular technology. So you need to be careful if there's a new technology showing up, not to too easily send that technology somewhere else, because it will go somewhere else. And then when you have to deal with it, you're going to be working with whatever rules that particular entity sets. So to what you said, Andy, there is a competitive first mover advantage, but I would actually argue that even in cases where you're trying to create a benefit for humanity, whether it's internet or web or whatever, if yours is the country that is trusted to create the standards, then you will always be seen as that center of excellence. That's the main point that I was trying to make with it. Above and beyond the standard, the typical thing typical advantage we all know in terms of lowered costs for implementation, development, et cetera, by all using a standard. So that I take as a given. But this is about why is it that the US should encourage that instead of, for example, Switzerland, right? There are there are plenty of organizations in Switzerland, there are organizations in other countries as well. So what is the advantage for the US in doing this? And I think it is because we have a long history of doing the right thing in this respect and being trusted in what we do. And we do not want to lose that. That is extremely powerful in the world and ensuring that we don't end up having to conform to standards that are problematic. Not saying Switzerland would be problematic.
And I agree. I use the phrase all the time. It's one of those things that it's, you look around the room in standardization, and if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? So.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I said I would, and I wanted to make a few comments and then to take this and not take it a different direction, but mention another aspect. You talked about public-private partnerships contributing to economic development. I think all the examples you heard along the line all contribute to economic development, advancing technology in various and different ways. That's been a long-standing purpose of how we develop standards globally and standards that are global standards that are domiciled in the U.S. I think, and I think there are many different models and many different groups of stakeholders and many different approaches. And standards can, as I think either Dan or Andy said, can either be a leading indicator. You have to standardize certain aspects of the technology in order for it to be start being commercialized, or the technology is already out there and standards are more of a lagging indicator. So it's not a one size fits all approach. The one twist I wanted to throw in, which I think comes in with the critical and emerging technology focus over the past several years and the US government strategy, is the national security aspect. For years, we've been doing economic development. And I will say in that context, I would disagree with Dan to some extent. Most of the private sector, company members I've talked to would prefer that a consensus standard is not associated with US leadership. It's associated with a global standard that meets all needs. I mean, you may, in fact, a lot of US corporate contributions have actually led to that consensus, but it's very important, I think, from the corporate perspective, not to be perceived as US dominated in a particular consensus activity. So keep that in mind. But I think the new twist we need to think about is the national security interest. And having been in both the government and the private sector, I'm the first one to say there is a national security interest in certain technologies, and in some cases that extends to the standards related to those technologies. But the government is not a super stakeholder in the national security space, as it is not in other spaces. And we are finding the private sector-led system with government participation are finding ways to incorporate those interests without having them undercut the integrity of the private sector-led global standards development process. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, Chuck, if I could add, ditto to many things that have been said, but I would interpret the economic impact, and I see this most in my sector, the ICT sector. I would translate that as to commercialization, right? And I think commercialization is a really timely and important objective for standardization. I think there's been a bit of a history of standards for standards' sake, producing a lot of standards or a lot of options within standards that never get implemented. A significant number of those options, were there because that was the consensus that could be reached, right, to allow the standard to actually be finalized and published. So from my sector's vantage point, they're really looking at standardization being a chapter in a continuum, and I described that in our Next G Alliance initiative. But it starts with R&D, then it goes to manufacturing, then it goes to standardization, but then ultimately it goes to market readiness and commercialization. And companies want standards where the commercial market needs those standards for competition. So I think particularly in sort of the economic pressures that a lot of companies are under, there is a much tighter coupling between standardization and the ability to commercialize the service or the product. So I think that's a really important aspect, particularly now.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I just thought of a question that we haven't talked about before, and I'm not going to ask it now, but I'm going to throw you a ringer later on.
A way to make us all nervous.
It's yeah, trying to keep you on your toes. We talked about a bunch of different models here and illustrated with different examples. Can you say it? And Susan, you particularly alluded to this, or actually, I apologize. It was Mary who said, leading versus lagging. Is the maturity of the technology, how much does that influence the difference in the way that things are approached? So, the maturity of the technology really matters, right? Dan, do you want to start?
I definitely wanted to comment on this. There's the technology and there's the ecosystem, and particularly in the domains in which I've been working, both are immature. And that's really important. You are often building, so in these newer STOs, I didn't watch the IETF get built, but I watched the IETF change over my lifetime. I did watch W3C get built. And as you watch new organizations get built, you see they all follow the same process, okay? And particularly now, it begins with, oh shoot, I guess we have to work together. Okay, but I don't want to do that slow, long, boring process that everybody else does. So let's just get a few of us together and we'll do something quick, right? And it always begins with quick.
Yeah.
And gradually they add in all of the rest of the processes that are always needed, which ultimately include an implementation requirement of some sort. Because every organization has encountered this, where you create these standards that are never used. There are many IETF RFCs that are not implemented and were never implemented, but they do have an implementation requirement now. The comment I wanted to make about the technology and the maturity is that it is only as the technology progresses and the ecosystem itself matures that you are able to begin to get truly effective standards that move beyond just a small number of companies. So you really can't talk about one without talking about the other.
Yeah. I don't know why this occurred to me, this marvelous cartoon that everyone in this room has seen about the realization, this conversation. Oh my gosh, there are 13 competing standards on this. We have to fix this. We have to have one standard that unifies all these. And the result is 14 competing standards, right? That's right. So anyway, Andy.
Yeah, I hope we're not doing that, but we probably are. No, I know we are. So I would say, yeah, this is one that is interesting because to me, it blends together two things that I often hear in the standards ecosystem spoken about separately, right? Pre-standardization and standardization. And actually, they're not two different things, right? So when the technology is perhaps emerging or less mature, that pre-standardization piece is vitally important. But what you're really doing is you're actually standardizing needs, understanding what exists out there in the space, what performance or what need are we trying to address. So you're actually in pre-standardization, you're doing a lot of needs analysis and then landscaping to figure out what exists, what doesn't exist. And we talk about that individually, but it's actually a standardization piece, right? And so we have put some things in place, our ASTM Accelerate program. It tries to start blending these things together to really look at how do we create models to do pre-standardization, lead into standardization, and get something effective out the other end. And the challenge to them, not necessarily is the maturity of the technology, but I think it's more the breadth of the technology, right? Because many of our systems are built around, and so this may be, it's not a challenge unique to ASTM, there's others, but because of our breadth across industries that have been built for many, many, many years on verticals. The broader a technology is, it's going to go across all those verticals, the harder it is to actually assess those needs and then align those with the standards gap or a technology gap, because every industry has a different need. And one place where that really shows up for us is in that additive manufacturing space I was talking to earlier, that resulted in our development of what we call a consortium on materials, data, and standardization. So we can write the standards around, here's how you're going to make additive manufacturing feedstock or feed materials and kind of standardize what those are. But like any standard, there's wide ranges. right? That may not be what's actually produced in the marketplace. If you were to look at many of our common materials that have been used for 100 years to date, steels, aluminum, copper, you name it, all those, many individual uses for individual industries, they had the luxury of time to build standards data around that on mechanical properties, on long-term stress and fatigue, on performance, that all get built into a database of knowledge. Mm-hmm. When these emerging technologies are coming out, we don't have that luxury of time, right? These are really compressed timescales that are getting out there. And so this consortium really is 40 organizations coming together, agreeing in a non-competitive space to share not business confidential materials data information, so that they can create that database of properties early and keep it updated so they can be accessed by even newer technologies like AI. How do we apply this against a database of all of these different, maybe additive manufacturing materials, processes, post-processing that are being used, and adapt that across these industries very quickly, right? So it's not necessarily the maturity of the technology, it's how broad that technology is.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Mary. Yeah, sorry, I've got the mic.
That's okay. If I can just add something, we also have to look at what types of standards are relevant in what part of the technology maturity life cycle. And I'll use, none of these critical and emerging technologies that we're talking about now, they all existed prior to being identified as a critical and emerging technology. AI and machine learning goes way back, and so on and so forth. The quantum technology has been around for a long time. But I will say, looking across a series of my experience from the policy perspective, looking at standards activities, they frequently start with terminology and nomenclature. That's what happened in nanotechnology many, many years ago. Because if you get around a table and you need to understand, what are we, nanoparticle size? But do we define particle size the same way? They didn't at the beginning of that process. The same, it's similar in the AI space. It's terminology and nomenclature, and I'm sure it'll be the same in quantum as well. Just to give 3 examples, because if you can sit around the table and you're all talking about something different, it's a little harder to standardize. So you may start at the very basic levels that you can have a conversation and work your way into the more vertical aspects. But even then, I'll give an example from AI, where you've got foundational standards written in SC 42 across a lot of different aspects of AI, generally speaking. When you get into vertical implementation, so AI in healthcare has a slightly different need for terminology or additional terms that have to be identified for the healthcare sector or the electricity sector, and et cetera. So it's a never-ending process, as you said, and we don't always have unfortunately, the luxury of starting where we all think we should start, because some other organization or country is a first mover, and you have to go to the table in a defensive mode. So I'll just put that in as well. It's never a perfect world.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. By the way, I'm jotting down gems that I keep hearing from each of the panelists, that my ongoing education about standards is ongoing. So thank you for that. I want to pivot to something that was triggered by both by Andy and Mary just now, talking about verticals. And many of you have been around long enough. There was a movement that was called, this is probably 30 years ago now, called Info Nano Bio, right? It was this whole convergence of different technologies and how they can influence one another. And of course, one of the challenges, as Mary just alluded to, the nomenclature, that there's two problems with nomenclature when you cut across verticals. One is terminology that one organization uses regularly that the other one doesn't really know. That's the easier problem. The harder problem is using the same term to mean entirely different things in 2 different verticals, right? So I'd like to talk a little bit about what does
public.
Yes, like public, like the word public, exactly right. So what does technology convergence, which is actually very exciting, what does that do to the different to models, and how do we deal with that? How do we address the challenge when it comes to convergence? And so, George, do you want to?
Yeah, since you were trying to go the opposite.
Right to left.
That's right, exactly. Depending on stage right or stage left, right?
Yeah.
No, I think as we've seen, you talk about technology convergence and talked about it being multidimensional, but how everything is much as more a systems approach and a system of systems approach. Mentioned from ULS&E, our first standard was on tin clad fire door. And all you did was test a fire door. It didn't have to actually be installed, hung where it's going to be, et cetera. You just installed the fire door. Looking at these systems now, especially within critical and emerging technologies, there's not AI in a box where you go to Best Buy and you pull AI off the shelf and you scan it and you bring it home, right? It is embedded in something. It is being applied to something. There is a system attached to it. And now you're looking at the system and how does the system react, which is also, I think, something that we're seeing on these critical and emerging technologies. A lot of the basis of standards, et cetera, for the last, I'll say 120 years for ULS&E was the product that you created at the time. And we'll talk about conformity assessment later, but then evaluated at the time was really the product through its life. You had to adjust for fatigue, you had to adjust for use, but the product was the same. And now with these critical and emerging technologies, you see a product that as it's learning is a different product and behaves differently later on in its life cycle than what you had before. And that is something that we are still trying to grapple with in terms of how do you address kind of not the life cycle due to mechanical, fatigue, et cetera, but the fact that this will be a different product through its life cycle because of its capabilities than what it was before. And I just say that not to be Debbie Downer on how complicated everything is going to be, but it really is a system of systems approach, which requires a lot more creativity and thinking, okay, who do we need to bring to the table as we're convening? Who really needs to be involved? Because there's the pressure of speed, which automatically tries to limit. And at the same time, it's thinking ahead. So just wanted to highlight that one angle of it that we're seeing.
No, thanks very much. I think, yeah, there's an enormous risk about not having the right people in the room with these convergence issues, right? Have to really deal with that. If there's nobody else to address that one, fine. Then I'd like to go on to stakeholder engagement and some of the external pressures that occur here. So the first question is, how do we enable stakeholders of all kinds to be in a position to make a reasonable decision about engagement in standards? How do we get that? And so I don't know, anybody wants to sort of tackle that one?
I'll start by asking the normal question. How many of you are actively engaged in standards development work? Okay. How many of you, before you got engaged in standards development work, actually had some kind of education in standards development work, or someone sitting there tell you, here's how you do this?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Nobody, right? So this is definitely a concern. Nobody generally comes into this standards development space with the intent of being a standards developer, right? And so it's a challenge. And I mentioned earlier, and I hammer this point every time because I do think it's the value of the ASTM process and the whole U.S. voluntary consensus standards process is that every voice matters, but that doesn't mean that every voice is effective, and that really is a key point. We see fewer and fewer folks getting involved in standards development, and those that have the knowledge and have done it for a long time, leaving the industry, right? So how do you replace that? And it's not an easy question because I can go out and find bodies and get them to my meetings and sit down there, and they'll probably do like I did when I first became involved at ASTM. I spent 1.5 years going to ASTM meetings trying not to become a member because I couldn't understand what was going on, right? So I'm sitting there looking at it, and I would say across all the standards development organizations, it's a shared experience. You walk in, you get that new member, you're excited, they meet a couple of people, but they sit in the meeting and they have no idea how this works. And there's really no formal way to get that. So we've done some things that we're trying to do to really address that. Number one is our emerging professionals program. So don't mistake emerging as young. That's not necessarily the case. You get folks like me after 30 years in one industry changes industries. I could actually be an emerging professional in the space. And I'm not even to the emerging part yet, right? So it's identifying these emerging professionals that we can get in the room by taking a really not a come to us, but a go to them strategy. What are we trying to develop? What areas do we see as opportunities, and what expertise is missing? So then going out to either companies, research institutes, whatever it might be, to directly try to engage those folks to attend meetings and get involved. But then really put a program around that to, as they start to get involved, to educate them on how the process works. Put them with active mentors that have been in the process for a while. They can say, you can read this process and procedure, you can watch our YouTube videos, still probably doesn't make much sense to you. What are you trying to accomplish? And maybe try this, maybe try that. So, and I find that having come out of that, that side of the standards development to be the most effective way. Identify those mentors early and really create those connections. And then we've also started, we've got 5 student chapters that we started. And instead of being, we're going to go to, I'll use my alma mater, Purdue University, we're going to start a student chapter. Everyone can join, if they're in engineering or science and technology field, they join. We've been very specific about how we've started these. And every student chapter has to have a direct connection to a vertical space in one of our technical committees. So what that does, it automatically builds a connection with whatever their direct field of study is, to that technical committee and what standards are being developed in that space, and provides a pool of ready mentors for them to get them understanding how standards development works, get them engaged in the process, getting them to know why standards development is important. And so I don't think there's really going to be any perfect way to do it, but I really, in the end, think that creating those personal connections on how does this really work is the best way. I can create YouTube videos all day long, and they may be more effective than go read our regulations and bylaws and show up to the meeting. But there's still the tips and tricks you don't get.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you've spotlighted is not just training and sort of immersion and sort of how to get proficient at engagement in standards, but I think it's fair to say that, like most of our critical and emerging technology spaces, we are collectively crying out for increases in workforce and expertise. Every single one of the CETs that I'm aware of, at least, doesn't have enough people involved. And I'm confident, having learned what I have learned about standards, that the same thing is true in the standards arena. I think you've just pointed out. So I'd like to maybe hear from some of you about ways in which you or your organization may formally or informally be trying to address that problem. George? You want to go?
Okay.
Well, yeah, fight it out over there. And
Yeah. So I feel pretty confident. I'm not going to address ATIS's approach, so I'm sure there'll be enough room for Susan. For UL Standards Engagement, I'll say we use the acronym, back to acronyms, SDO, but I would argue we're not a standards development organization, but a standards convening organization. I found early on, I can't just say, I want a standard on my desk by Monday, like Jonah Jameson, right? And give me Spider-Man. And a standard would just appear, because we don't develop the standard ourselves. It's not something that happens. We're really that standards convening organization. And so starting a couple of years ago, recognizing that, created an entire stakeholder engagement program, put resources and funding towards having people specifically on it. And just in the last year, increased 11% the number of new members that we have participating in standards. And we're getting groups that we never had before. We have a number of standards with AMI, which is kind of medical device communication. And we never had nurses on our standards panels related to nurse call stations. Sounds like a group that may be, I don't know, interested in the standards we're developing and then get implemented. So last year I had a very focused effort to go get the voice of nurses and getting them involved. And what we found in trying to do all of this is that bringing that value proposition is extremely important. Not like just the what's in it for them, like, well, use the call station. I mean, it's a little bit more in terms of the time and the investment, especially for the organizations. And then I really liked the examples on the training because until a couple of years ago, I think we viewed standards as an apprenticeship program. Oh, you'll join a technical committee, you'll sit at the knee of the person that's done this for 20 years, and maybe in 7 years, you'll also be able to do a standard, right? And we realized the apprenticeship model does not work anymore based on the speed and the need. And so also created very specific training programs to onboard. What does it mean to be a member? How do you, I mean, from the mechanics of using our systems through, and the shift of looking for the voices that we needed to have at the table that weren't, and then that shift from apprenticeship model, if you will, to focused training model really has paid dividends for us in that those 11%, they're all active. They're all voting. You know, we're not trying to be ghosted, as my teenage daughter would call it, on all of these standards committees. So those are two things we've done. Great.
Yeah, and I would just add, I don't know if you're all seeing this, but we're certainly seeing this. Companies are no longer hiring for standards organizations, right? Historically, companies would find really bright people who had significant advocacy and mediation skills, and they had an expertise, and they would say, okay, we're going to send you to a standards meeting. And then guess what? You became part of their standards organization. It's not actually working that way any longer, where they're hiring into the standards organization. So what we have found as an organization is we've actually had to go to the company and go on a bit of a scavenger hunt and say, okay, where's your 6G team? Do you have someone who does X, Y, Z? Because they would really benefit from being at the table on this piece of work. So it's really placed a significant responsibility on our organization to help find the match of the work that needs to be done with the expert that we need access to. And you know, the companies are, you know, many of the companies are large. They all have these experts, but it's a bit of a hunt to go find where they are resident and then convince their executive that they need to be at the table, and here's why. So that's sort of the reality check that I find we're often in the current environment.
I just like to say that this I'm sorry.
Go.
This is fascinating to me because this is a big company problem. So I've spent most of my career at startups, and at startups, there is no standards person, believe me. What happens is there's some engineer, you know, working on the product or product manager or somebody like that. And they get told, hey, there's this standard thing. Why don't you go to it? And they go and they're just, you know, overwhelmed. And then they find out it's going to take 3 years and they got to get their product done tomorrow. And, you know, what's wrong with all those people are idiots. And some of those engineers learn that they have a facility for it and eventually end up doing it. So it's really fascinating to me to hear you say that even the larger companies now are beginning to shrink or remove their standards departments. That's a significant change. You always need the technical people involved, but it takes time to get good at standards, even with the training. I really like your comment about mentoring. You need both, I think, right? One of the things I used to always tell people is that standards are corporate politics in a technology domain.
Yeah.
Actually, I said it's politics in a technology domain, but I can't use the word politics in this part of the country because it means something different terminology. But and that is something that you have to learn, particularly if you're an engineer. You know, it takes time to learn that the reason those technical arguments are being given by that company is because they have this product and they need it to work this way. There are 5 different technical directions that are all equally valid. Okay. And they're really pushing hard on this one. But if you don't understand that what those drivers are for the different participants, you will not be able to help find a consensus among them that actually works for everyone involved.
Yeah. Agree with everything that all the comments that are made. And I know as Andy and Susan and others have mentioned that individual standards developing organizations have training and mentorship programs. ANSI has numerous training and mentorship and for delegation, training a delegation lead, a tag administrator, and so on and so forth. But what I want to talk about in addition to that is we need to get beyond what I call the usual suspects. And I've been in standards for a long time, and it's, we want government agencies there, we want private sector corporations there, we want consumers there, we want a variety of stakeholders. But the new technology arena, in addition to moving very quickly, brings in stakeholders that we didn't usually tend to think about. Now, consumers are not a stakeholder community we didn't tend to think about, but we've just made a press over the past several years at ANSI and trying to actually reach out to consumers specifically to enhance their engagement. And ASTM and UL have existing programs, but many other SDOs don't. And consumers need to be at virtually every table because we're all consumers and we're users. What we found is the value proposition is key. What gets a consumer organization or a consumer to the table is very different than what gets a company representative to the table. And that's something, and that's without mentioning stakeholders in the environmental area, in the civil society area. They're not engineers, but they need to be engaged in these discussions. They are lawyers, they are philosophers, there are a range of different constituencies. And I have found in starting the discussions with some of these organizations that are brand new to the standards arena and standards ecosystem, that they are quite skeptical about standards developers and the standards system, and skeptical that their voice will be heard. So it's something we have to deal with. Once we get them to the table, we can train them and educate them, but we need to get them to the table. Why would you come to this table to talk about artificial intelligence bias or ethics? Or that's a challenge that I think we all need to address because they're not the usual suspects.
Okay.
Yeah, Mary, to your point, we actually, in some of our newer initiatives, we actually have a filter that we apply called what are the societal and economic impacts? And so, for example, we're doing that with 6G. It's largely driven by the fact that companies are just implementing 5G and they're like, why are we already on to 6G? Even though there's a 10-year, cycle time in delivering a generation of wireless technology. But we now have a group that is focused on what are the societal and economic impacts. So that, for example, we can have AARP at the table saying, I'm going to need these applications in the next generation of wireless because of the aging population, right? So it's, call that a vertical, if you will, but still it's what are the societal and economic impacts of this particular technology and how it gets standardized.
Terrific. Thanks very much.
Jump in
Yeah,
one
sure.
thing? Two things, actually. Mary made a great point, right? The consumer space is really hard because that value proposition, sometimes it's hard to express that value proposition. And really the other thing is that they do feel like you need me in the room to maintain balance or whatever, but you're not actually going to listen to me. And so I find one of the most common things besides every voice matters that I'm constantly preaching is when I'm talking to them is that the power in the process is in the negative vote, not in the positive vote for a reason, so that your voice does matter. And most of them, if you start to engage them to try to get them into the room, they don't actually believe that at first. They have to see it happen. Right. And then once they start to see that or understand that is, yes, your voice actually does matter, then that changes the dynamic a bit. And then I'm going to give a shameless plug on the other thing about bringing folks to the table. And I'm bringing it, I got Brian Meinke sitting out here. That's our Vice President of Business Development. And it was key in this. It's our ICAM event, which is the International Conference on Additive Manufacturing, or now I think we changed it to Advanced Manufacturing, coming up in October. But this really was an effort to, how do we take one of these emerging technologies, convene a bunch of folks together around that technology to share information and advance the technology, but also help us identify those technical experts that we could pull into the space, right? And we've done that effectively. We've taken, I think last year we had 850 participants, about 475 technical papers. Over the course of the 3 or 4 years we've been holding it, we've brought in those technical experts directly into ASTM. Something like, I think Brian could correct me, like 12 PhDs, another dozen master's candidates in additive manufacturing that can bring that expertise to the committees that don't have it, right? And so that's been very helpful for us in getting those folks to the space.
Terrific. Let me help you complete the shameless plug. I'm sure that the details of that meeting are available on the ASTM website.
Of course.
Of course. Good. Very good. All right, thanks. Because the time is elapsing faster than I thought it would, and I knew that was going to happen because it's a stimulating conversation, I'm going to throw my ringer in. By the way, you shouldn't be worried because it's actually kind of a softball, but I think it's an interesting one. What is the single most common, or you could, I'll let you interpret, most damaging misconception on the part of government stakeholders in high office, whether that's, in Congress or whatever? What is the single thing that you think people don't understand about standards, and what should we be educating people about? I'm not trying to get people in trouble, especially me, by the way. It's recorded, but I'm just curious, what do you find surprising that people don't know? George, you want to start?
I'll start as one of the ones that's been on both sides of the tablecloth, right? So I found, especially now and looking back on it, that one of the things with respect to government engagement that is most difficult is then making sure that the government is clear in terms of their role and what's happening at the end. In other words, if it is a government regulatory agency that wants to participate in I'll call it voluntary standards process, and we can probably, I know that clock is right, but so we don't have enough time. But so have another whole panel just on, there's the standard and then there's the standard, right? So it's pretty clear up here, there's a spectrum of standards. But depending on the government department agency participating and their role, being clear of what their role is as part of this, right? Because oftentimes regulatory agency start being considerations into backdoor rulemaking. Is it going to be incorporated by reference? Some sort of, I'll say, like mandatory conformity assessment or application of it versus government in US, I'll stick with US government participation for something there where it's clearly going to have a different, maybe more voluntary.
Okay. Thanks much. Susan.
Yeah, I'll be a little provocative. I think with the government, and some of this I would have to also apply to the Hill, that standardization is a way to deal with the problem of China. I think we've got that wrong. I mean, I'm going to be speaking at NSA next week about this very topic, and there is this view that through standardization we can correct what is happening with China, and the fact is, China, to have true global standards, you need to be able to collaborate with China, and I think we've had many, many years of proof points on that collaboration. And so it's interesting to me that, after a very long career in standardization, that, couldn't get the Hill to appreciate it, had trouble getting government to appreciate it. And now it's the word that's rolling off the tongue of everyone. And so I'm grateful for that, right? It puts us front and center in a way that we can now educate. We really have a platform for that. But it is not the way to compete with China.
Okay.
Susan used the C word.
I did.
Yeah, it's
Collaborate?
Yeah, collaborate.
Yeah, collaborate.
right. Yeah.
Thanks, George. You're my straight man.
Come back to me.
Come back to you. I don't know that this is any new thought, right? That it goes along with what George said. What I see is that standards and regulation are not synonymous, right? Standards, voluntary consensus standards, support regulation. But then I would also say that as I think about what Susan was saying, I don't think the challenge is just China. The challenge is authoritarian standard setting versus voluntary consensus standard setting. And the misconception, I think, that may be most common is saying it doesn't make it so. That if you want to use the power of voluntary consensus, it comes with the messiness of consensus.
Mm.
You don't always get what you want, whether you're a government regulator, an agency, a policymaker, that you have to actually advocate and develop consensus. And it's messy and not always fast and easy.
Got it.
Okay.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah, I think what I want to add, I agree with all of these, or most of these comments. I don't know. We'll have to see on China. No. So one of the things I think is important to remember, this is going to sound obvious, but having worked on areas that are really, they're core technology standards that are wide ranging in their implications rather than, you know, the tin door example, okay, which is extremely important, but the ones I've worked on are these broad ones. Technology is neutral, okay? Technology is neutral. One of the things that really concerns me is when I see, whenever I see attempts to make it political, okay? Because everybody loses. I remember hearing that actually in the blockchain space a number of years ago where someone said, the worst thing that could happen to the blockchain space would be for it to become political. It's kind of like the internet, right? Is the internet, you know, look, the internet is for all of us and it needs to be for all of us. This is what standards allow us to do. And this consensus process that you're talking about, it is essential to ending up with standards that we can all use. So I think that's the one thing that it sounds obvious, it may sound trite, but it is, it's neutral. It needs to remain neutral. It needs to be seen that way. Your opinion is only one opinion, and you need to work with other stakeholders in order to find something that allows all of us to use it. Yeah, you get more benefit by working together than you do by working apart.
Great, thanks. Mary.
So I'm going to go back, and I agree with everything folks have said, and go back to what I think was an original intent of your question, is that it's a different message for technical experts, at least in US government agencies engaging in standards activities. And also to George's point, different for a regulatory technical expert in a regulatory agency versus and a procurement agency. Agencies have different interests. They're mission specific. But I think you might have been, or what I wanted to address in addition is at the policy level, that's where the money is obligated. And so it's important for us, the private sector and NIST and others, to be able to communicate to the decision makers at agencies the value of their agency technical experts participating and funding those activities. We've already seen, I'm saying it now, we've already seen in ANSI activities responding to ISO and IEC in the past several months. This is a significantly bad budget year. It could be worse next year. We're seeing folks call and say, I can't get the funding to continue to participate in this standards activity. It's a problem. I think Susan had mentioned consistent, presence. So there's a message for the decision makers that needs to be very high level. And then the Hill. And we've had some success on the Hill, and I think what success we've had has come with taking the message one level up. They don't have time, the staff or the members, but certainly not even staff, to get into the nitty gritty of how the US tag is formed and how it goes to ISO and IEC. What they need at the high level. This is the integrity of system. It's a rules-based system. There are various checks and balances. There are different, really important messages. There are different modalities of participation. There's different decision-making processes, representation, and participation. And don't think it's one size fits all, because it's not. And then how does that link to Susan's point about technology commercialization? And one message we have for congressional staff is be very careful about legislating overly prescriptive solutions for a technology problem that will then have a negative impact on the ability of the standard system to move forward. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Since you, George, sorry.
Just to Mary's point on the funding, I think one of the values of a conversation like this today is that reflecting just on my time in the federal government, like every year was a bad fiscal year and budget year. I mean, sequestration. Why did Congress do that? Because there was no way they were ever going to let sequestration happen, right? They made such dramatic cuts. They would always make sure they figured out a budget in time. I think they haven't passed a budget in time without a CR in almost 20 years now, for example. And I think the value of this is that every year's a bad budget year. There's a lot of work done just to preserve what we have, right? I mean, OMB is famous for saying flat is the new doubling when it comes to budgets. So my words, not NIST's, for the examiner watching the call. No, it really is then value of this conversation of how else are we going to do it? Because as much effort as it is just to preserve the current funding, probably I like being in a portrait room because I think every person on the wall here has probably talked about how it was a bad funding year and just trying to preserve what they had. So, the value is how else are we going to do it? Because Mary's exactly right. Like in terms of the federal government fiscal pressures that are feeling.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. Really insightful comments, and I think I'll still have a job tomorrow, so that's good. I wanted to go back to something that Mary just alluded to and has come up over and over again, which is this path to commercialization, and where commercialization is really, I think, the goal, frankly, of most standardization. You want to catalyze markets, and I think there were people who talked about that. So, but with commercialization as the end goal, how does that influence, or how does it have an impact on the way that standardization unfolds? Yeah,
I'd like to say something about this that's kind of like a pre-comment,
Okay.
and if it takes us too far away, then
Go
stop
for
me. But I think you said commercialization is, I think, the goal. I think commercialization is the driver when it's done correctly.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I want to point out that distinction is that I've seen examples in standards developing organizations to try to create frameworks too soon. I noticed it actually a lot in the blockchain space. There are various groups, they want to define the blockchain framework. Well, I was in this blockchain community and I saw them innovating in every possible direction.
Mhm.
So to try to put a framework on something that is, still, it's a hot mess, yes, but it's because there is new development happening rapidly. That kind of thing is a problem. So I get a little concerned, if we think of commercialization as the goal rather than the driver, then you can end up trying to standardize in advance of really knowing what the heck you're doing. Defining the framework is a form of ownership. And let's face it, SDOs do this, okay? SDOs will have competing frameworks that they create, and ours is the best. And I think that's something that we need to watch out for as we look at commercialization. IETF, one of the things that the IETF does that I liked is the let many flowers bloom approach, where they just require for any piece of work, well, there's a number of things, but one of the first things they require is a problem statement. I can't tell you the number of times in every standards organization I've ever been involved with where someone comes in with a solution and that's what they want to standardize. But you will not make progress until you're talking about the problem that needs to be solved.
I think that's great. I think one of the, in most organizations, one of the questions that you'll hear often is, what problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's a means of trying to ground things. So thank you. That's a really insightful statement. I appreciate it. So let me amend my question. Instead of saying commercialization is the goal, to commercialization is the driver. And how does keeping that in mind influence the way that standards are developed, and in particular influences the way we're talking here about public-private partnerships? And so how does it influence the approach in public-private partnerships?
Susan, grab the microphone first. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that I really see it, and I think I said this before, in our sector, there's a tighter coupling between standardization and commercialization than I've seen in a long time. And it comes from, my board did a bit of a discussion around, for example, 3GPP standards, which really, those are, to host one of those meetings is $1 million plus meeting. It's, 2,500 participants from all over the world. It's at very high cost, very high stakes, and they're looking at what you're only implementing 10 to 20% of the standards of what comes out of there. And so it's gone up to the executive levels where they, are applying a filter. Do we really need this? Do we really need it now? What's it going to do for our business? How are we going to generate revenue from it? Why do we need all these functions? I need this function now, not at the end of the standard cycle. So those kinds of discussions are actually going on. And I think the standardization process, the standardization community is going to need to find a way to innovate to this kind of focus that maybe hasn't been so sharp before. It seems to be sharper now. Now, will the pendulum swing because we're just in a demanding economic time? Maybe that's a sector view. But I think these kinds of views are now out there in a way that they haven't been before.
George?
Yeah, I wanted to actually come back to something that got mentioned much earlier on in the discussion with this question, and that's about speed. And I think the importance of having commercialization, back to a driver is because of the speed and the fact that, if you look at things like we're living in the exponential age where things are just happening so much exponentially quicker, the time from design to market so much faster than it has been before, that you can't do it in that serial approach for the EEs out there in terms of looking at it. Okay, we're going to do pre-standardization, then we'll do standardization, then we'll look at conformity assessment, shout out to Gordon, and then we'll look at how do we go from there. And it can't be done that like that anymore because of the speed. It's like, okay, we have a week on pre-standardization, probably not enough time to get there. And it has to be done in a parallel in a much more compressed way. And I think that speed, which is also not something you say, well, we'll just slow down on that. That societal speed, I'll call it, is really a driver on this that I wanted to highlight because it got mentioned earlier, but I think then wanted to bring that back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a really important point. Andy?
Yeah, I'm going to take it in a little bit, maybe not a different direction, just I'm going to expand the direction, right? Mary mentioned policy and not being too rigorous or structured around prescription. Commercialization to me and policy are in the same vein. They're directional. They're not endpoints, very much like Daniel said. They're directional. And it doesn't end at pre-standardization and then standardization. We get a standard and that's it. We'll modify that as it goes. Most of these emerging technologies are transversal, horizontal across all of these industries, and they are going to be built up by an ecosystem of standards. No longer does one standards developer own a space, right? So I'm going to have pieces of a space, and Daniel and Susan, we're all going to have the same pieces of the same space. There's a need downstream of the standardization we talked earlier about workforce development and getting people into the standard space. There's actually a need for that workforce development on how do you use that standards ecosystem? How do these all apply? How are they going to help you become better? How do they help you achieve the goals we want for the true beneficiaries out there, the public, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's a need in terms of once we all do this very important work, how does it create impact and how is it used? So,
fantastic. Thanks very much. Dozens of times, I think we've had references to pre-standardization. And I think there may be another opportunity for misconception there, or let me put it differently. There are probably many different models of pre-standardization. So could some of you tell us what you think, I shouldn't say what you think, what pre-standardization is for your perspective? What are the elements and why is it important and why is it powerful? So who wants to start?
Nobody's jumping up. See, that's what happens with the new guy in the room. He's always the fool that wades right in, right?
I'm right behind you, Andy.
It's your honeymoon period, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm past my 100 days when I can blame my predecessor, but
right.
This won't be real prescriptive, but I'll tell you in my mind what pre-standardization is. And to me, it's any activity that's a catalyst or incubator leading into standards development. And that can be many different things. It can be marrying technology roadmaps with standards roadmaps to identify the gaps where we need to take action or where there's a need that we might address. It could be research and development with a research to standardization output, right? How do we get effectively into that technology research and development space? So as that research is conducted, there's a realization that there are some pieces of this that don't have to be novel to each individual organization participating, but there's a reason to look at how do we standardize that output. It could be early convening mechanisms. I mentioned our ICAM event. It really is bringing thought leaders together in one space to just talk. Throw all the things up on the board. What are their challenges? What are their opportunities? And where does that lead? What gaps can standardization address in that? And then we have a number that I look at in terms of that pre-standardization of building stakeholder engagement. How do we might memorandums of understanding, training, emerging professionals, student events, those kind of things. How do we just get people in the room around those new technologies or those new areas to start to coalesce around standards needs? So I think there's a lot of different things that can do it, but to me, there's all kinds of methods we can use that are really catalysts to getting to what the gap is and what the need is.
Really terrific. Susan.
Yeah, Chuck, I would say ditto to everything Andy said, but then let that play out in the context of international standardization. How we regionally do that pre-standardization really is important groundwork when you move into the international community, because some regions of the globe are very good at pre-standardization. You probably have all observed that in various ways, but I think it's, how it can be so many different things, nothing magic to it, but it's how you coalesce around that next step of standardization. But doing it here in North America can often make the difference between leadership or other regions leading. So I think that's really important.
That's particularly true in the critical and emerging technology space.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
At a high level, building on what Susan said, I think doing research and some aspect of that is pre-standardization research enables really robust technical proposals to go into global standards organizations, and where you want to come out with a consensus so that at the end, they can't say, well, this was a US proposed opportunity, but you want the best technical content going into at the beginning of the consensus process to build that. And then being back at NIST, NIST measurement research is an important underpinning of not in all cases, but in many cases of standardization. And NIST has long recognized out of the labs that is technology transfer. You take your measurement expertise and your measurement results, and where relevant, you take it to a standards table, and that results in a more technically robust standard. So I think this is all very important. One important aspect of the U.S. government strategy and this discussion and the other discussions we've had that I see is we're now looking at the larger standards, standards continuum and a standards life cycle that actually starts with research and then pre-standardization and then development and implementation, and then you do the round again. So I think that's something we hadn't had prior. It was more focused on here's a standards venue, and you take something to the table and you come out with a consensus. So this is a really important expanding the range of activities that are relevant.
Could I just add one footnote to what Mary just said? One of the things that I would observe, and I find this in our organization, as we have a lot of collaboration agreements, memorandum of understanding with other regions of the globe, governments actually do a lot of funding of that pre-standardization work in other regions of the globe. And often when we're sitting down with India or Japan or Korea, we're sitting down not only with their industry, but with their government, because the government has a significant and important tie into the activity, and it's called funding. So we actually, again, so that we could really put our fingerprint, North America's fingerprint on what's happening with 6G, we looked across all the regional organizations that we're dealing with, and in every case, they're getting funding for the pre-standardization and the standardization work. Now, I know that's not controlled by NIST, and we all have, similar challenges across the spectrum of what we do at this table. But that funding piece becomes a big play when you look at other regions of the globe from their governments.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. That's something that we saw extensively. And in fact, when you talk about frameworks, when you talk about proper research and having the best technical proposals, I see that happening a lot more in Europe than I do here. In the US, so maybe my statement about it's, commercialization is the driver, maybe that's a US statement, okay?
Yeah.
Because in the US, we tend not to see the same kind of advanced funding in that respect. And so it gets done either by large companies that have research budgets or by small startups that are desperate to create something and they do the work, but they're not getting paid for it. They're hoping they'll get paid for it down the road. So in the US, I think we have a very different model for how that information happens. And sometimes it doesn't happen. So they come together in a standard and basically you're just trying to get them to agree that their competitors should be there. Because the first about it is when, two companies come to you and say, oh, we need to standardize this. And then you realize, wow, you better get everyone else involved.
Yeah. George.
Yeah, one thing on the whole discussion on pre-standardization I wanted to bring up is that as we've been talking critical emerging technologies, and a lot of focus is on developing new standards, but recognizing that, and I think it came up on somebody mentioned the life cycle of the standard, that if we get too focused on just creating new standards, I described it within UL Standards and Engagement that we create a first edition standard and it's like a kid that lives in your basement for the rest of its life because there's a lifetime of care and feeding of the standard. Like it doesn't leave the house, right? You create the first edition standard and then you've got to take care of it for the rest of the standard's existence. And that is a real responsibility that the SDOs have. And the other thing is that as we're looking at, and I view admittedly all of this as managing risk, but as we're looking at managing risks for any of these critical and emerging technologies, we're taking the lessons learned of how we managed the risks before and applying it to these. And a lot of that is coming from existing standards also. We talk about creating new standards for some of these new batteries, and we're using all the lessons learned from the battery standards that we've already developed. And so I just didn't want to lose sight of the importance of the maintenance and the continued upkeep of standards once the first round is created, and then also the incredible library of knowledge of managing risk that is in the existing standards as we're talking about pre-standardization. We don't come into these meetings with a blank sheet of paper and say, how should we write this standard? There is a lot that's born on it. And I hadn't heard that here, and I didn't want to lose sight of that in the discussion.
Really fantastic. Thanks very much. We have very limited time left. Well, I'm assuming we're leaving at noon for lunch. So we have 7 minutes. I'd like for each of you maybe to spend a minute addressing, back to specifically public-private partnerships. You probably have already touched on it, but I'd like you to maybe summarize what you think of as best practices with respect to public-private partnerships. How can we maximize the utility of these? So,
Can I read my list?
you can read your list. Do whatever you like.
I have a cheat sheet because, as I said, we just published that report. So just going to read. Generally speaking, I think we've covered all of this, but a defined what's the purpose, what's the problem we're trying to solve. So a defined mission, clear benefits. The participants have to see that there are clear benefits, resources, appropriate and sufficient engagement, communications and awareness. I think we have emphasized that, but not sufficiently. That is ongoing. Communications awareness, it's an iterative process, and really important, connecting the partnership, however it is expressed, to outside activities. So communicating what's happening in the partnership to other constituencies and continue to make that relevant. So those are high level.
Great. Thank you.
Best practices.
And by the way, you're welcome to pass if you don't have anything that you want to add to what's already been said. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
I'll be more brief than I have in my previous answers, and it would have been nice if that report came out 2 days before this conference, because we all fell asleep probably reading it last night. But the timing was great. I would say the one thing I would add in the public-private partnership, especially on the government side, we could talk about that there's not enough resources or funding or maybe addition of new technical expertise. I would say that a best practice that I'm seeing is that when we do get that government public engagement, that they're empowered. Being in the room is one thing, but coming with the power to actually share and make decisions is extremely important. And it really slows the process, or I won't say slows the process. It creates misconceptions about effective engagement that may not be there unless those participants are really empowered to make a difference.
I think everybody's had the frustrating experience of a salesman saying, well, let me go check with my manager on that. Right?
I'm just observing.
I'm just observing. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I'll just make 2 comments, and it's nothing you haven't heard before today, but I really like the comment about don't be too prescriptive about the solutions. Okay, this is extremely important. And maybe this is an example will get me in trouble, but GDPR is good, requiring USB is not. Okay. The other comment I want to make was that, and this is related to my verifiable credentials and decentralized identifier comment with Silicon Valley Innovation Program, is incentive for the commercial participants to cooperate, I think is extremely important. And if you do that right, then they will do the work that you need to be done, and they will do it in the right way. So structuring that is, I think, the direct participation is good, but when you can provide the right incentives to commercial entities, I think that's the best.
Thanks much.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I would add just one other dimension to it. And it's that when government and industry are at the table together, that there is a trusting relationship, that where the expertise is resident, let's go say the private sector, that they are to take the lead in developing the solution, that standardization is still a private industry-led activity.
Great. And George, final word before I sum up.
Trust.
Good. All right. Fantastic. Well, I can't believe more than 2 hours has gone by that fast. I'm stunned. I think this. Yeah. Wake up. No. So I've jotted down lots of notes, but the one I'm definitely going to carry away is the visual of my kid living in my basement for the rest of my life. George, that was inspired. Thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful visual. I am overjoyed to have spent the time here talking about something so important and so critical to the future economy and to the development of new technologies, the critical and emerging technologies. And I'm deeply grateful for the more than 100 years, probably well over 100 years of expertise in standards development that is represented at the table. It's really sort of awe-inspiring to see. And so I think they all deserve an enormous round of applause. So